Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Well, if I have to ask the question, is there a doctor in the house? We know we have at least one. Hello, Dr. Nicole. She's hiding, so it's probably a good idea. Your lawyer must have told you to do that. Well, welcome here. We're ready to have today's noontime program, Navigating Tumultuous 2020. For the last, nearly a year or so, you've been involved interviewing folks from around Springfield, Central Illinois, Southern Illinois, Northern Illinois, all across the state, the stories of the pandemic, how folks dealt with it in various ways from various sectors of our society. So this is the conclusion of that project, but by no means the end of it. As Amanda will tell you, the interviews are all online for folks to take a deep dive into the stories. So without further ado, by the way, we are recording this for a YouTube presentation later on, and we will have the chance for you to ask some questions following the presentation. So don't be shy. We'll be sure to pass the mic around if anybody has any questions. Now to tell you about the Tumultuous 2020 project, the stories, as heard, directly from the folks around Illinois. Here's the project manager, Amanda Riggenbach. Amanda.
Hello, and thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's really nice to see some of the people I've interviewed here. I really appreciate you coming on such short notice. So I guess we'll just jump right in. So as Joe Crane said, this is Tumultuous 2020. And basically the project has been focused around documenting the pandemic through the lens of personal stories in Illinois. And it can all be found at oralhistory.illinois.gov. So that's kind of like the basic welcome to the program. But I really wanted to dive in today and talk about what the project is, some of the challenges, the goals, and what the end product has been. And so what we set out to do last August, let me see, there we go, was to, as I said, capture the Illinois story of the pandemic. And so as you can see, we've gotten quite a geographical spread. There is an amazing oral history volunteer who's done a bulk of those northern Illinois stories because he lives up in Kane County. And so this project was created by ALPLM, and it was funded by a very generous donation from a former volunteer. And ultimately, the goal is to capture these stories and make them available to the public. And so, like I said, it's all available on our website where you can dive into little audio clips if you don't have, say, 2 hours to listen to Dr. Florence's amazing interview, not to single you out. And so, some things that I've really learned over this year is that oral history was the perfect medium to tell these stories. The pandemic impacted everyone, and oral history allows you to get a microscopic look into the individual lives that were impacted by this event that impacted all of us. And so, I always like putting rhetorical questions on my PowerPoints because, who did the pandemic interview? Or, who did we interview? And we really tried to interview everyone to represent the different people who were impacted. And it's really interesting because some people went through devastating experiences, and at the same time, other people were able to find new normals that worked for them, and they were able to adapt and create a life that worked better for them than their life pre-pandemic. And so we've done over 80 interviews across the state. And one thing that I've really learned throughout this year is how do you even begin to talk about these traumatic events, especially for the people who experience such devastating losses. And it was something that I was able to talk to some oral historians in New York, and it's trauma-informed oral history, which is allowing people to take control of their narrative and allowing them to be the one to dictate how their story is told. It's an exchange of power. You're letting them lead the interview while also, being in charge and, guiding questions. And so I think that's one thing that was really important for this specific project because a lot of people I interviewed, people who lost family members, it wasn't like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, a decade ago, it was 2 months ago. And having that sensitivity to that fact and allowing people to stop for a minute, to pause the interview, even if that is, important audio to have, if they're comfortable and if they're uncomfortable, it's important to let them, process. And so some of the key takeaways, and I know, why are we starting with the key takeaways? I think they'll provide a good lens to look at these oral histories that we'll examine, is that people persevered in a variety of ways. And they were able to get through these traumatic events in different ways. People did so with the helps of their communities, which we'll see in some of the key interviews I've highlighted today, with their communities, with their families. There's with internal fortitude, people finding strength within themselves. You'll see at the end slide, some people got through it with the help of their dogs, with their pets. I think we all kind of remember the craze that was going online with people buying those pandemic animals, right? With different animal shelters, really getting a lot of people supporting them. And then some people got through with humor and ultimately with courage. These interviews that I've been able to do, and the interviews that the volunteers were able to do, it's so interesting to hear people close their interview with saying, I didn't realize how traumatic my events were until I talked to you about it. And I think that's an important part of Tumultuous 2020, is that it isn't just looking back at events 10 years ago, it's looking at what you went through very recently and a way to process that trauma. And so I think that I'm really proud of the work that we've done here as a way to document it, but as a way to also give people a space to look back at their events. And so I wanted to start by showcasing an interview from a Harvard elementary school bilingual teacher. And so what I mean by bilingual teacher is that he has a co-teacher in the classroom with him, and he teaches in Spanish, and his fellow teacher teaches in English in order to help students become bilingual. And so what he emphasizes that I think is a good way to start this talk with these interviews is just how crazy everything was. The pandemic, almost for a lot of people, started overnight. It was like, we heard things about it, and then suddenly, oh my gosh, there's a lockdown. So he does that in a really good way.
We got the good news Friday morning that we have to go remote. We have to prepare. We have that weekend. So mainly that Friday. So it's like, okay, guys, now you're going to teach using the internet. The kids are going to stay at home. They will have their Chromebook. You guys have your computer. You're going to work from home, and they are at home too. How are we going to do this? Working with the 5th grade team. Yeah, we put everybody's expertise, especially in technology and programs that we could use with the kids. That day, as on Friday, okay, I think we know how we are going to start on Monday. But after that, it was always talking to my team. Okay, what we are going to do, how this program runs, how you do this, how you do that, and it was a very nice team effort that we put together.
What I think Antonio highlights about the pandemic is, one, that overnight nature of everything just happening at once, but also the way that we adapted, the way that his team of teachers were able to accept the situation. It was out of their control, and yet they worked extremely hard to provide quality education to their students. And I think he also just highlights this way that, like I said, people just came together, and I think that shows a sense of bravery. In a similar vein, Twyla Terrell is a bus driver for Peoria Public Schools, so moving south from Harvard, Illinois. And her experience is similar, so we're kind of in that school sector of the pandemic. And she highlights this total uncertainty, and I'll let her speak for herself.
We came in as normal, and then we start hearing on our route the panic of they saying, go get groceries, go stock up. Something coming on. We're getting ready to have a pandemic, everything getting ready to get shut down. Parents telling us that. They was getting their kids, when they did come, they had a car full of groceries. So we're like, we better go. So by the time, I think it was March the 8th, yeah, I think March the 8th or March the 6th, I got to look at my thing. We came in, they had the hazmat suit on, And they said, we got the pandemic, they got to spray the bus down, and we left. Come back Monday. We came back Monday, everything was closed down. We didn't work.
So I think she highlights this part of the pandemic that, we always heard about, if you don't have school-age children, you hear about these things happening within the schools, but I think hearing this interview where, she's living this experience is a really important aspect of, oral history and proves that value. And so while Antonio and Twyla express this overnight happenings with the pandemic and just the way that people were coping with it, the next set of interviews I want to highlight, having some trouble with this clicker, is August Morzowski. And so he's the owner, was the owner and head chef at Augie's Front Burner, which if you are a Springfield person, then you certainly know about Augie's. It was quite a staple. And I want to highlight the fact that he was a pioneer in the farm-to-table movement here in Springfield. He was one of the people who helped bring the downtown farmers market. And so truly a staple of the community. And yet, when the pandemic hit, Augie's Front Burner didn't quite have the infrastructure to support carry-out dining, especially in the beginning. They didn't have the online system set up. And I mean, it takes a lot, especially if technology isn't always something that you're comfortable with. And so I think what he highlights is this different side of the pandemic. Yes, with these people in the school system, everything happened overnight, and then it was go, go, go. But for Morzowski, his experience is a little different.
That period of being closed, I really got a feel for what it's like to be a real person. I mean, to actually, to feel like I could do things for myself and have go outside and smell the roses, in other words. I mean, it was weird not having responsibility, not having planning. I have to plan for this, have to do this, have to do that. It was just, I kind of liked that. And I'm getting to be 65 June of that month, and that's when I shut down my business. And that pretty much, was the end for my life and career of Augie's Front Burner and the chef. But yeah, COVID was kind of a good thing for me.
And so that last part, I think, really highlights the point I'm trying to drive home, is that for some people, COVID opened doors. And while he ended up shutting the door for Augie's Front Burner, it allowed him this time to, as he said, smell the roses. And funnily enough, when we had our pre-interview, he talked to me about all the things that he's doing now. He's a beekeeper, he has a huge garden. So it's just really interesting how the pandemic really affected everybody so differently. And so I think it's important to keep highlighting them. And the next person is Shatria Smith, who is the executive director of the Garvey Tubman Cultural Arts and Research Center here in Springfield. And so she became the executive director there in November of 2019, where she was working on a part-time basis, trying to get her feet under her of what it means to be an executive director of a growing nonprofit. She was also working part-time or not part-time, but still full-time with District 186 here in Springfield as a teacher's aide. And so when the pandemic happened, it allowed a time for her to be home and work with the kids online while also trying to figure out the pandemic. And then at the same time, she found herself having time. And her coping with the pandemic, I think really is something that people who turn to remote work experience. And so I'll let you listen to her story.
Well, everybody was talking about it. I was like, what am I going to do? It was spring. So I was like, I'll start a garden because I was missing my littles and having something to care for. So it was my first garden. And I, prior to that, had a brown thumb. But of course, there's family lineage and propensity of gardening. So I was like, let me see. So we started a garden. I did tomatoes, peppers, basil, just things that I usually use on a regular basis, things that we use. And it turned out wonderfully. And I babied my garden and I took photos of the little mushrooms because I was overwatering it. But the mushrooms were cute too. We had a raised bed. I had everything I needed, the sun, the water, the soil. It was beautiful.
So what I think is that she highlights is that moment in the pandemic when everyone was baking bread. Everyone was finding things to do within their home that they didn't really have time to do before. And I think that that's a really important part. And so the next person is Gabriela Ramirez, and her experience was also difficult. So she started working full-time remotely while having 3 children of her own at home. So 2 of them were in high school, or one of them was in high school and the other was an 8th grader, and then the last one was in preschool. So that was a really challenging time for her. On top of working full-time, she was working hard to make sure her children were getting an education. And then her nephew came to stay with them because he didn't have Wi-Fi. So she was taking care of a 4th child. So her life was completely turned upside down. And her husband was experiencing health issues, so he wasn't able to really help navigate that with her. So her way of coping with that also relies on turning to what you have around you. And so her story is very interesting.
I started crafting in October, and I learned of this program through my son's school at that time, his middle school. They actually sent out an email, and they said whoever's interested in, crafting, and the crafting will be remote, so you didn't have to go into a location again with the same thing that, making sure everybody's kept healthy and safe. They said it would be from the comfort of your home, and I was like, hey, I like crafting, I'm gonna respond to this. So I responded, and I was able to get enrolled. I'm still enrolled now. We go to the school, we pick up our materials, whatever we need for the new crafting week, and then we log on. It's not Zoom, it's the Meet Me, like how the kids go to school, like they connect online, and then all the moms are there, and we just start talking and how's everybody's day, and then we start crafting. I love it. I love that program. And like I said, I'm enrolled in it now again this year, and I'm like, I love it because it's just my time to shine and my little oasis too, because I like to do crafts. It was something that I'm like, oh my gosh, with all this that I'm already got on my plate, could this be something that I can do and handle? But again, Eddie steps in and he's always like, okay, what do we need to do? Or, I'll take care of this. Meanwhile, you go to your class.
So this demonstrates this moment where everything is so busy, and yet because of the pandemic, she was able to do this crafting courses online. These kinds of things wouldn't have been so available to people if she had to go to the school to do the classes. And so the pandemic opened up these doors for people to do the things that they like while being able to do it from the comfort of their home, making it more accessible. And so the next person that I want to highlight is Gus Gordon, another local fixture here in Springfield. And he was a really interesting person to talk to. As the executive director of the Hoagland Center for the Arts, when the pandemic started, everything had to stop for them. And one thing that he said that really stuck with me was that the show doesn't always have to go on. And I think that really it's a different way of looking at things. When previously everything is just go, go, go in his life, learning to accept that it's okay to stop, it's okay to take a breath, was something that the pandemic taught him, that having that time away taught him. And so I'll let him kind of tell a bit of his story before talking some more.
The most amazing thing happened when this pandemic started and we had to close our doors. We started, when we'd come in once a week to collect those checks, to collect the mail rather, we would find unsolicited checks from some of our donors, people who had been supporters over the years, who would write us a little note that says, hey, I know how tough this must be for you. Here's a little something to tide you over. And that little something could sometimes be a check for $500 or $5,000 or $10,000 in a couple of cases. Without even being asked, they came to us. That was reassuring that what we're doing is obviously resonating if people are willing to make that kind of sacrifice and that kind of donation without even being asked. Then we started asking. So we started talking with a lot of our biggest donors who had been very supportive over the years personally, and we'd have Zoom calls or invite them over socially distanced, and we'd show them the need. And many of them came forward to help. Most of them did. Some weren't in a financial position to do that. And then we started, sending out a mailing campaign to everybody on our mailing list. Hey, this is the position we're in. And the public came forward. The public has been incredibly kind.
Kept this clip a little long because I think he highlights two important parts of the pandemic. So the community coming together, he represents this part where, the previous interviews that I highlighted were about people going within themselves to find the strength to get through the pandemic. Whereas the next couple of people we'll talk about highlight that community element of moving through this tumultuous time. And so it's just so interesting, too, how he talks about the way that people gave without even him having to ask. And I really like that story because I think it gives us a lot of hope for the future. So the next person is Patrick Harper, because his story is really interesting because he's a United States Public Health Service pharmacist and a Center for Disease Control and Prevention field assignee to the Illinois Department of Public Health. It's a mouthful, but his interview was very interesting because he brought this perspective of someone who was going to the mass vaccine sites and helping run them. He was doing all of this work that was very much behind the scenes, but really helped Illinois' pandemic response get on its feet. I mean, if we didn't get the testing set up that we did, things would have been a lot worse. And so his story talks about the way the officials in these mass vaccine sites kept morale up, because he was living in Springfield but was deployed to Chicago for a couple of months away from his family, quarantining with these other officers or commanders. He's a commander. And so he talks about the way that morale was kept up, and I think that is a really important part of the pandemic.
We were there with the Public Health Service. The National Guard was there for the Army and Air Force. The state police were involved. The Department of Public Health were involved. The central entity that kind of kept all that glued together was the incident commander from Rescue SA. His normal job was with the Chicago Fire Department, and one of the individuals intimately involved with our operations up there was a chief with the Chicago Fire Department as well. And the way they utilized their community connections to provide morale boosting services to the footprint of personnel that was up there. Breakfast, lunches. On Memorial Day, we had a big cookout, socially distanced outdoor cookout with live music and stuff. They did something for all of the moms who were deployed when Mother's Day passed, because we were there in May. So just little things like that really do a lot to boost morale. These guys were on top of it. It was really cool. So. And
what I think is so interesting about Commander Harper is the way that these, all these government entities that were, that first line response to the pandemic, they're humans too. And to see how they were being taken care of during the pandemic is something that I don't think, us civilians don't have a lot of insight into. And so the next person utilizes the community response in a different way. So if you were at my History Happy Hour presentation, Colin Corbett will look a little familiar to you. I think his story is really important because he was a participant of the vaccine trials, specifically the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And his reasoning to do so was because he wanted to have the greatest possible impact on his community, which is something that, that was not something I was at all aware of, is the possibility of being involved in these trials. And so his experience with that is very interesting, so I'll let you listen to him.
Evening of July 30th, I got a call from Optimal Research, asking me to be in a COVID vaccine trial. They called me at like 7 p.m., which was surprising because usually they're closed by then. But I guess they were desperately trying to fill slots for this trial, and so they asked if I'd be available the following afternoon to come in for a screening, and so I did, where they like drew my blood to see if I had already had antibodies and gave me a PCR test, all of that stuff. I had heard in the news about like the Pfizer vaccine moving soon to phase 3 trials, but this was for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which had not really been in the news before. Particularly was for their phase 1 trial, which meant that it had been tested in animals and like a very tiny group of volunteers just to make sure that it didn't have any like extreme immediate effects. But I was basically one of the first 1,000 people on the planet to get that vaccine. And so when they called me on the phone about it, I had assumed that it was going to be the sort of Pfizer phase 3. But then I got there and learned that it was the Johnson & Johnson phase 1, which made me kind of nervous. So they have like a packet of their informed consent document. It was like 30 pages long. I figured, I mean, even if there are significant side effects or worse than that, like the potential for making a major impact in the course of the pandemic made it worth volunteering.
I think Corbett represents this community of people that are often not seen, who are testing these vaccines, who are willing to risk their health in order to see if these vaccines will be okay for the general public. And part of the reason that community is often unseen is because of privacy concerns. I mean, the companies that are running these testings aren't really allowed to document them, and Corbett is someone I was able to find because he talked about it in the newspaper, and then his story got picked up, and so I was able to contact him. And so, his community that he was in part of, this, vaccine trial community, is so important for the way the pandemic moved to the stages that it is, and hopefully as we continue to move into an endemic. So the next person, Dr. Florence. I'm sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot. She is right here. And she, as a doctor, is one of those people that, was really involved and always doing stuff to help the pandemic. And her interview was really interesting because it feels kind of weird talking about you with you right here, but but her story was just, I think, really interesting because using her position as a doctor in order to help ease vaccine hesitancy concerns. So I'll let her speak for herself on the audio clip.
I tell you, I have no words. When I found out that there was a vaccine, it was going to be offered without question, I was like, sign me up. It was very important for me to be still part of that education and promote folks getting the vaccine. When I got my first vaccine, I drew a Sharpie tattoo on my left arm that said, "Hope goes here." And it was really important for me to, even through social media, I think the governor actually ended up posting my picture of my "Hope goes here," to really spread it to people. This is safe. This is something we need to do.
As a normal person who's not in the medical community, normal person is not the right word. I digress. As someone who's not in the medical community, I'm getting that messaging about the vaccine being safe. But then to hear the story of someone who is immersed in that and who is working on, helping people become more comfortable with the vaccine, I think her story is just so important, an important part of this tumultuous 2020 archive. And so the last person I want to highlight, and I apologize for not having a picture of him up here, but he's the executive director of Why Men in Lawndale, Chicago. And his story is really interesting because when the pandemic started, all of their after-school programming had to stop because of pandemic concerns. And so they were wrestling with how are we able to keep impacting our community while keeping them safe. And so I'll let him speak for himself about the ways that they pivoted.
So some of the things that we did to pivot was, of course, we became a distribution hub of resource that included the computers that we gave away, but there were many people that wanted to be part of a collaborative team to ensure that the resources that existed got to families that needed it the most. And we were connected with many neighborhoods and families in the community. So people started reaching out to us, and we began to form these collaborative pipelines of resources. We had a shipment of 200,000 eggs from County Farm who wanted to get eggs out. And this was a time when the cost of a dozen eggs had risen to $7 a dozen. And they donated a semi-load of eggs. And Wyman was able to secure 20,000 eggs of the 200,000 eggs. It was only 10% of the semi, but still it was a total of 16,000 dozen eggs that were donated. And we made sure that those eggs, not one went to waste. It got to the families that needed it the most.
So, well, one, I'd like to say I'm glad I live in Springfield where eggs don't cost $7 a dozen. But also, I think he brings about this point where all these community resources came together. And, you know, as we are weathering this pandemic and we weather just misinformation, a variety of hurdles in many different ways, I think it's important to look back on the people who were working hard to make things work. And so, you know, I wanted to just highlight kind of the scope of the people we've interviewed. You know, like I said, 80 plus, and there are several of you guys here, and if I didn't include you in this, it's not because I didn't like your interview. I wanted to, if I had like 2 weeks to just present, because I think all of these stories are so important and highlight these parts of the pandemic. You know, people like the woman up there, Lisa, well, there's a lot of women up there, but one of the women up there, Lisa Badger, was one of the first cases in Springfield. You know, Marvin Hightower experienced the pandemic as the NAACP chapter president or branch president in Peoria, Illinois, and his experience was different. All of these people have stories that tell us about the pandemic experience in a way that maybe you didn't experience it. And I just, you know, it's been the honor of a lifetime to be able to manage this project. You know, every person I've interviewed has been an amazing human. Whether or not, you know, I agree with them, it doesn't matter. It's about these people and their stories, and being able to document them is just, like I said, the honor of a lifetime. And so, you know, these are the faces of the pandemic, and I appreciate your time. Thank you for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amanda Riggenbach, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll come over with the microphone so everybody can hear. And we have one right down here in front from...
I'm a loud talker.
Yes.
So, Amanda, first off, it was just such a pleasure to hang out with you for a couple of hours. I don't know if the others felt that as well. But I'm curious, now that you've wrapped up this project, what has changed in you of maybe your perceptions of yourself, your life, or even your community?
That is a fabulous question. And, you know, as I kind of reflect on this past year, it was a year of a lot of changes for me, you know, moving to Springfield being one of them. And it showed me just how complex, you know, I was an English major in college, so it's like I already knew people were complex, but getting to talk to all of these individuals just highlighted the complexity of each person and their experience. And it made me really glad to be, even though we lived through these difficult times and having these hard experiences, it made me grateful to have this job, to see the strength of people, to see that perseverance, because it just, I mean, it amazes me. And, just kind of looking at this picture, and thinking about my project coming to an end, it makes me a little emotional because these people are just amazing humans. You are an amazing human, and it was an honor to be able to talk to everyone.
Any other questions? Raise your hand. In the meantime, I'll just offer a comment, Amanda, and I don't know if this came up in any of the interviews, but in that collage of photos of people you interviewed, there are a couple of dogs that are just absolutely adorable. Don't see any cats, nothing wrong with cats, but I have to think, I don't know if this came up in any of the conversations with them, but I would gather that for a lot of dogs especially, maybe not most or cats could care less, I think, but I think the dogs probably loved the pandemic because their people were there with them all the time. They didn't leave at 8 o'clock in the morning and like mysteriously come back at 5 o'clock.
Yeah, no, the woman with the large picture of the dog, you said that cats weren't really mentioned, but actually her roommate adopted a cat, but her work actually took her outside of the home. So she got to spend all this time with the cat that the cat ended up preferring her over its original owner. So she ended up taking the cat with her when she moved.
Any other questions? All right, over here. Another person that doesn't need a mic, but for recording purposes.
Amanda, I'm worried I'm going to put you on the spot here, but we've worked. So I work with Amanda, and we've she's had the office next to me throughout this process, and she's done a great job of telling all these other people's stories. But again, you can just refuse to answer this if you want. But I've never do you have a pandemic story that I've never really asked you, but your pandemic experience? Do you have a story you'd like to share now that you're close to wrapping all this up?
Well, I was graduating from Bradley University in Peoria in 2021, so I was very lucky to have missed that period of 2020 graduates where they didn't really get anything, which, as you can see, that was one of my interviewees. And so my pandemic story was really interesting with just graduating in 2021 where things were more opened. I ended up being exposed to COVID my last weeks of college, so I wasn't able to experience that, and I work in the library and museum, so obviously I'm a nerd. So that was pretty heartbreaking. But I guess that was one of them. Yeah. Thanks for asking, and thank you for your question too, Dr. Florence.
A couple more, okay.
Thank you, and thank you, Amanda. I think I'm going to be haunted by the Augie quote of when he had to go home. He finally figured out how it was to live as a human being. Did you find a lot of that in your interviews, that folks having to just sort of go home, the break with the pandemic, figuring out that maybe they hadn't been living their best life and there's a lot more they wanted to get out of life?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so for Augie, to clarify, he's always been a human, but his experience, interestingly enough, was he was always doing something new at the restaurant, so he was never home. There are so many people like that, and so, there's that sensitivity to the fact that a lot of people suffered, but a lot of people found themselves with a new quality of life. Someone I didn't interview was my cousin, and I mean, every other month, I feel like I see her in a different country because she can work online now because of the pandemic. And so she's able to travel abroad with that flexibility. And so, yeah, no, it was definitely something I saw a lot of. And, of course, there were people who were able to, remodel their homes, doing those DIY projects and just finding a life that suits them better. The pandemic forced us to slow down. And I think for a lot of people, that was a beneficial thing.
We're ganging up on you here. Sorry. Another coworker. Amanda, with you noted at the beginning that you were so close to the event and with these interviews. What I can remember, this is years and years ago, a graduate class on taking oral histories. You always have to try to maintain distance from the subject or try to elicit questions that build on that person's experiences. Are there any plans for future interviews of perhaps the same people as time goes by, as their experiences build, they're able to reflect? I mean, it just seems like such an important topic. Like, if Mark had been able to start with World War II veterans in 1946, and building forward, this is a real opportunity I see this as, an amazing social history of an event in Illinois history, to build on that. I'll let you answer that, sorry.
Yeah, no, definitely coming from a historian's perspective, I really appreciate that. My time with the ALPLM is ending next Monday. So unfortunately, I won't be there to oversee that part of the project, but I certainly hope that will happen. I think that, I hope so. I wish I could answer that a bit better, but yeah.
Well, on that note, again, thank you to Amanda Riggenbach for today's program, Tumultuous 2020.
Thank you.